When you think of sushi, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Maybe it's a high-end omakase counter in Tokyo, where a master chef places a single, perfect piece of nigiri in front of you. Or maybe it's a colorful California roll from your favorite neighborhood spot, drizzled with spicy mayo and topped with crunchy onions. We associate sushi with Japan as much as we associate pizza with Italy or tacos with Mexico. It is the undisputed crown jewel of Japanese culinary art, a symbol of precision, freshness, and minimalist perfection. But what if I told you that for the vast majority of its history, sushi looked, smelled, and tasted absolutely nothing like what you see today? What if I told you that the original sushi wasn't even Japanese? And perhaps most shocking of all, what if I told you that for hundreds of years, the rice, the very thing we think times is times the sushi, was actually considered garbage and thrown straight into the trash? Today, we're peeling back the layers of history to uncover a story that spans thousands of miles and 2 millennia. It's a journey that begins not in the pristine kitchens of Kyoto, but in the sweltering, humid river valleys of Southeast Asia. It's a tale of survival, accidental chemistry, and a radical transformation that turned a stinky, fermented peasant snack into a multi-billion-dollar global phenomenon. Buckle up, because the true origin of sushi is wilder than you think. To find the true birthplace of sushi, we have to travel back over 2,000 years to the banks of the Mekong River, a massive waterway that winds through modern-day Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. Now, try to put yourself in the shoes of a farmer living in this region in the year 200 BC. The climate is punishingly hot and incredibly humid. You don't have electricity, you don't have ice, and you certainly don't have a refrigerator. But what you times have is an abundance of freshwater fish from the river, especially during the monsoon season when the fields flood and the fish are everywhere. The problem wasn't catching the fish, it was keeping them from rotting in the tropical heat. If you didn't eat your catch within a few hours, the bacteria would take over, and you'd be left with a toxic, foul-smelling mess. This was a matter of life and death. If you couldn't preserve your food, you wouldn't survive the dry season. So, these ancient ancestors of ours got creative. They discovered a process that would eventually change the culinary world forever, though they didn't know it at the time. They called it times Narezushi. But here's the kicker. The original sushi wasn't a recipe. It was a preservation technology. The process went like this. You'd gut and clean the fish, rub it down with a heavy amount of salt, and then here's the important part. You'd pack it into a jar or a wooden barrel layered with cooked, plain rice. You'd weigh it down with a heavy stone, seal it up, and let it sit. Now, if you did this today and left it on your counter, you'd probably expect to be evicted by your neighbors because of the smell. And you wouldn't be entirely wrong, but inside that jar, something miraculous was happening. The salt drew out the moisture from the fish, while the natural starches in the rice began to break down. This triggered a process called lactic acid fermentation. The rice acted as a sugar source for the bacteria, which converted it into acid. This acid then pickled the fish, preventing the bad rot from setting in. The fish could stay edible for months, sometimes even a year. But, and this is the part that blows modern minds, the rice itself became a gooey, fermented, stinky mush. It had served its purpose as a chemical preservative. So, when it was time to eat, the people would crack open the jar, pull out the preserved fish, and throw the rice away. Think about that for a second. In the original version of sushi, the rice was just the packaging. It would be like buying a sandwich today and eating the ham but throwing the bread in the trash. The word sushi itself actually translates roughly to sour tasting, referring to that intense, fermented tang of the preserved meat, not the fresh, vinegared rice we love today. As trade routes expanded and populations moved, this clever preservation trick began to travel. By the 2nd century AD, Narezushi times had made its way into China. We find mentions of it in ancient Chinese dictionaries, like the Times Shuowen Jiezi, which describes a dish of salted fish and rice. At this point, it was still a practical food for the masses. It was the ultimate to-go meal for travelers, soldiers, and laborers. You could carry a small jar of fermented fish with you on a long journey, and it wouldn't spoil. It was salty, it was pungent, and it provided the protein people needed to keep going. But here's where the plot thickens. While China was instrumental in refining the process and documenting it, sushi eventually started to fall out of favor there. By the time the Ming dynasty rolled around centuries later, the Chinese had moved on to other methods of cooking and preserving. However, before it faded away in China, it had already hitched a ride across the sea to a small island nation that was about to take this stinky fish and turn it into an art form. When Narezushi times arrived in Japan around the 8th century, during the Nara period, it found a perfect home. Why? Because Japan was a Buddhist nation. At the time, imperial decrees often banned or discouraged the consumption of four-legged animals. This meant that fish wasn't just a choice, it was a dietary necessity. The Japanese took this stinky Southeast Asian river snack and began to integrate it into their culture in a way no one else had. In fact, it became so valuable that it was actually used as a form of currency. Imagine paying your taxes in fermented fish. Historical records show that people in the provinces would send jars of Narezushi to the capital in Nara as a form of tribute. It was a high-value commodity because it was stable, portable, and essential. But as the centuries passed, the Japanese started to get impatient. You see, the original Narezushi took months, sometimes up to a year to be ready. And let's be honest, the smell was intense. There's a famous Japanese story about a man who hid his sushi in a ceiling crawl space, and the smell was so strong people thought there was a decaying body in the house. The Japanese people loved the sour taste, but they didn't want to wait a year for it. They also started to realize that the rice, while mushy, didn't have times to be thrown away. If they could just speed up the process, maybe the rice would still be firm enough to eat along with the fish. This brings us to a massive turning point in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Muromachi period. This is when we see the birth of Nama Nare. Nama means raw or fresh. In this version, the fermentation time was cut down significantly from months to just a few weeks. Because the process was shorter, the fish was still relatively fresh by medieval standards, and the rice hadn't turned into a liquid paste yet. For the first time in history, people started eating the fish and the rice together. But even a few weeks was too long for the bustling, growing cities of Japan. The people wanted their sushi, and they wanted it now. They were on the verge of a culinary breakthrough that would involve a secret ingredient, one that would finally allow them to ditch the long fermentation process entirely and invent the instant sushi that would conquer the finer world. But to understand how they did that, we have to look at a man who lived in the bustling city of Edo, modern-day Tokyo, and a radical invention that turned sushi from a preserved snack into the world's first true fast food. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Because the man who invented modern sushi wasn't trying to be a gourmet chef. He was just trying to feed a crowd of hungry people who were in a massive hurry. Welcome to Edo, in the early 1800s. This wasn't the quiet Zen-like Japan you see in travel brochures today. This was one of the biggest, loudest, and hungriest cities on the planet. It was a city of construction workers, merchants, and samurai, all looking for a quick bite between shifts. But there was a problem. The sushi of the time, what we call Hanaya Yohei or quick sushi, wasn't actually that quick. Even though chefs had started adding rice vinegar to the rice to mimic that tangy, fermented flavor without waiting months for it to rot, they were still pressing the rice and fish into heavy wooden boxes. They'd let it sit under a weighted lid for hours or even days to let the flavors meld. In the fast-paced world of Edo, 24 hours was an eternity. People wanted food now. Enter a man named Hanaya Yohei. If there is one person you should thank for your spicy tuna roll, it's him. In 1824, Yohei set up a small mobile stall in the Ryogoku district, right near a busy bridge over the Sumida River. He realized that if he used the new, high-quality rice vinegar that was becoming available, he didn't need the wooden boxes at all. He did something revolutionary. He grabbed a small ball of vinegared rice, shaped it with his palms, and slapped a slice of fresh fish right on top. He called it Nigiri sushi, literally hand-pressed sushi. This was the Big Mac moment for Japanese cuisine. You didn't sit down at a table. You stood at Yohei's stall, grabbed a piece with your fingers, dipped it in soy sauce, and ate it in one bite. It was the world's first true fast food. And because the fish came straight from the nearby bay, the Edo May, or in front of Edo, it was fresher than anything people had ever tasted. But wait, there's a catch. This wasn't the raw fish we think of today. Remember, there were no refrigerators. If Yohei just put a piece of raw tuna on rice in the humid Tokyo heat, his customers would be dead by morning. To keep the fish safe, Yohei and his contemporaries used chemistry. They marinated the fish in soy sauce, simmered it in broth, or cured it with heavy amounts of salt and vinegar. That's why, even today, traditional edamame sushi has those deep, savory, umami flavors. It was a marriage of preservation and speed. For nearly 100 years, this style of sushi stayed mostly in Tokyo. It was a local specialty, like a Philly cheesesteak or a New York slice. But then, in 1923, tragedy struck. The Great Kanto Earthquake leveled Tokyo. In the aftermath, the city's sushi chefs lost everything. With no stalls and no customers, they packed up and headed back to their original hometowns across Japan. They took Yohei's fast food technique with them, turning a Tokyo street food into a national obsession. But the story doesn't end in Japan, not even close. Because if you think the jump from fermented river fish to fresh Tokyo tuna was big, wait until you see what happened when sushi crossed the Pacific. Fast forward to the late 1960s, sushi had arrived in the United States, but it wasn't exactly a hit. To the average American at the time, the idea of eating raw fish wrapped in black seaweed, which many thought looked like garbage or carbon paper, was, frankly, terrifying. Then, a chef at a restaurant called Tokyo Kaikan in Los Angeles had a Hanaya Yohei moment of his own. He realized that Americans loved the rich, fatty texture of tuna, but they couldn't always get good quality tuna in LA. He also noticed they hated the texture of the seaweed on the outside. His solution? He swapped the fatty tuna for creamy avocado. Then, he did the unthinkable. He flipped the roll inside out, hiding the seaweed under a layer of white rice. The California roll was born. Purists in Japan were horrified, but the California roll did something incredible. It acted as a gateway drug. It made sushi approachable. It bridged the gap between two completely different cultures. Once Americans got used to the rice and the avocado, they started trying the yellowtail, then the salmon. Then, finally, the raw tuna. Today, sushi is a multi-billion-dollar global industry. You can find it in high-end Michelin-starred temples in Ginza, where a single piece costs $50, or in plastic containers at a gas station in Nebraska. But when we look at that piece of fish on rice, what are we actually seeing? We're seeing a 2,000-year-old survival strategy from the Mekong River. We're seeing the ingenuity of Chinese farmers who found a way to make rice do the work of a refrigerator. We're seeing the hustle of an Edo street vendor who just wanted to feed hungry workers. And we're seeing the creativity of an immigrant chef in California who wanted to make his culture's food accessible to his new neighbors. The truth is, sushi isn't just Japanese. It is a living, breathing map of human history. It's a story of how we adapt, how we innovate, and how we share our lives through the things we eat. It proves that authenticity isn't a fixed point in time, it's a journey. So, the next time you pick up those chopsticks, take a second to look at what's between them. You're not just holding a snack, you're holding 2,000 years of global evolution. And honestly, it tastes pretty good for something that started out as a pile of rotting fish in a swamp. If you found this journey as wild as I did, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps the channel keep digging up these hidden histories, and I want to hear from you. What's the weirdest sushi roll you've ever tried? Was it a masterpiece or a mistake? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.